Hey, welcome back. This is Joel Duff, and we're doing a little episode of Flood Geology Failures. Yes, the young Earth creationist model for understanding all of the geological formations on Earth as being the result of a global catastrophic flood 4,350 years ago. In this series, we examine observations we make from the geological column. We ask, do those fit the expectations of this thing called flood geology? And most time we find that flood geology fails to explain the observations that we make. All right, we're back to look at another observation. And this observation actually comes to us from the Institute for Creation Research in a very short article by Frank Sherwin here. Let's see, Frank Sherwin has a master's degree in biology from probably the early 1970s. And then he has an honorary doctorate from Pensacola Christian College. He taught at Pensacola Christian College, which is one of the few really strict young Earth creationist colleges. And then for a number of years, almost 20 years now, he's been writing and working for the Institute for Creation Research. And he's going to bring us a short article about dinosaur footprints, right? Preserved footprints. And I've done numerous videos about the problem of footprints for young Earth creationists and flood geology. How do you have millions of footprints preserved while you have the globe covered with water? All right. And you have all the sediments piling up 20,000, 30,000 feet deep. And yet, between layers of these sediments, we find footprints of dinosaurs, footprints of mammals, footprints of amphibians, lots of footprints of birds. Right, and footprints of other tiny organisms. All right, when you add it all up, it's hundreds of millions and billions of footprints are preserved for us in this geological column, and that is a serious challenge to flood geology. The flood geology model that all those footprints must have been formed within just a few weeks, all right, maybe a few months in just 1 year, the flood year, just 4,350 years ago. So here we have an image of a bunch of footprints. And young Earth creationists agree these are footprints that were made by an animal, right? They're not denying that the shape they're not saying, well, these look like footprints, but they're not actually footprints, right? They just happen to look like it. That's an angle they could have taken, all right, with all the footprint evidence in the fossil record. They could have looked at things that look like footprints and say, like, well, were you there? Did you see an animal walk by and actually step in that mud and make that impression and then watch the process of fossilization to be sure that that was actually the remains of something that was caused by an organism doing it? No, they don't do that. I really have not met any, I'll call them professional creationists, people who really think about this, who actually have some science background, right? And think about how to interpret the world in a young Earth creationist way. I don't know any of them that would deny that what you're looking at in this picture was the result of an animal walking across a former surface of the Earth, all right? Which that is interesting in itself, right? Because they'll deny lots of other things about the geological column, but not this. I think it's just so apparent, right? Because how else would you explain this? How else do you explain these particular impressions, these particular shapes, if not for the fact that they actually represent feet, despite the fact you never saw the feet actually making the footprint, right? So, Ken Ham's "Were you there?" No, you didn't have to be there. And some young Earth creationists agree. You don't actually have to be there and see the animals making these footprints to have a high degree of confidence that that in fact is what actually happened. That's why I find his claim, right? That way of okay, well, I can't explain this. And then it's like, oh, well, were you there? Well, how do you know? Young Earth creationists often apply that "were you there" argument very inconsistently. All right, let's get to it. Let's get to this article. It's very short. I only want to make a couple points. Dinosaur trackway leads straight to young Earth, right? So these dinosaur footprints, not necessarily the ones in this picture, they just represent footprints. But the footprints he's going to talk about, they lead straight to a young Earth. Right? Do they? Let's find out. Uncovering animal tracks and trackways in sedimentary rocks is a testament to the global flood, to the Genesis flood. Uncovering animal tracks and trackways in sedimentary rocks is a testament to the Genesis flood, right? A global flood. Right? So that's the opening salvo. Hey, there's footprints out there. That is a testimony of a Genesis flood. Is it a prediction of a Genesis flood? I don't think so. I would think that a prediction of like a massive flood that laid down hundreds and thousands of feet thick layers of sediments, all in a very short period of time, would predict that you wouldn't find footprints between those layers. Right? Or that if you did, they should be exceptionally rare because it's very hard to imagine organisms running around on surfaces making footprints during a flood. And so just starting out with this first line, it's not immediately evident that trackways and animal tracks are a testament to a Genesis flood. I don't read anywhere in Genesis where it says, like, I don't know a chapter or verse where it says that during the flood, animal tracks were made, all right? That animals made tracks during that flood period, and you should expect to find them. All right, so that's just not a prediction we would make. Fascinating discoveries continue to be made, with the latest trackway, 200 prints being unearthed in Oxfordshire, England. The largest trackway is estimated to be 492 feet or 150 meters in length, and probably longer. In other words, the rocks maybe disappear underneath another layer and they can't follow that trackway any further, but presumably it might even go a farther distance into the rock. And therein lies the problem. Okay, so he's telling his audience, this is a problem to have such a long trackway. How could you make such a trackway? Well, now, is he saying he's saying the global flood can actually explain this. He's saying this is a problem for those who believe in an ancient Earth, that you can have long trackways. Why is that? Many who are involved in the uncovering of these incredibly old footprints do not realize this remarkable physical evidence is a two-edged sword. See, you found these footprints. You think that that's evidence against us. You think that's evidence against a young Earth, against a flood of making these fossils. But actually, it's a two-edged sword, right? I'm going to turn it around on you and show you how these footprints are actually evidence that the world can't be old. Yes, they're beautifully preserved prints of extinct animals. Like I said, he admits these are animals that made these tracks despite never having seen those animals make those tracks. He's inferring from observations about past events. In other words, he is making judgments about history, right? Investigating history, historical things. Historical science, which Ken Ham always poo-poos, right? We got observational science, and then you have experimental science. I mean, he kind of mixes those two together or talks about them together. And then you have, historical sciences. Were you there? How can you really know? All right, you can't really trust historical science. But for Frank Sherwin, perfectly fine with these being preserved prints of extinct animals. But they cannot be as old as evolutionary theory states due to, now here it comes, multiple catastrophic events of erosion. Right? Multiple catastrophic events of erosion. If the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, virtually every square inch of the Earth's surface would have experienced a host of erosive events. I agree. Like every part of the Earth over 4.6 billion years has experienced a lot of erosion and upheaval and metamorphism and, all kinds of stuff, right? There really isn't any place on Earth that's not transformed to some extent by a 4.6 billion year history. But these footprints aren't 4.6 billion years old. Earthquakes. Okay. So then he's going to quote, and guess who he's going to quote? He's going to quote himself from a previous article. That previous article was another horrendous article, which, I don't cover all of his articles or all these articles, but that one was about the fact that many arches out in Utah are falling. And that's evidence that the world can't be old because otherwise they would have all fallen down by now. Just to put it in a nutshell. So he's saying earthquakes and tectonic activity no doubt would have occurred on dinosaur trackways many millions of times. Earthquakes of a magnitude of Richter scale would have happened over and over and over again. In addition, there would also have been many millions of years worth of meteorites, tsunamis, bitter cold, hail, volcanoes, climate change patterns, ice ages, tornadoes, flooding, windstorms, drought, lightning, hurricanes, meteorological activity of all sorts. Basically what he's saying is, because there would have been all this activity, this long series of footprints should have been worn away, should have eroded away if the world is 4.6 billion years old. Now, these footprints are, 166 million years old. So that cuts out a few billion years of time. Still, there's no doubt 166 million years is a long time. They say you got to stick around for 166 million years when there's earthquakes and tsunamis and meteorites that could hit that particular spot. What are the chances of that surviving? So that's his hey, so do you feel like you have the tables turned on you, by the way? Right? See, these can't be old. They have to be young, because all these other activities have happened, should have destroyed those long ago. They couldn't have survived. It's basically, not all the fossils we have on Earth, they couldn't have survived for billions of years, and therefore the Earth must be young, right? Otherwise they would all have worn away. It kind of harkens back to the argument that, if the world were a billion years old, then there wouldn't be any mountains. There wouldn't be anything, because it would all worn down, or erosion's all happening. He seems to be completely oblivious to some basic fundamental rules about geology, right? And plate tectonics and so forth. So then he goes on. In addition, English paleontologist Richard Butler made an interesting statement regarding the formation of the trackway. So speaking of this long trackway, we don't know exactly what, but it might have been there was a storm event that came in, deposited a load of sediments on top of the footprints. And that meant that they were preserved rather than just being washed away. Storm event? A load of sediments? Frank Sherwin says, this observation certainly supports the flood as described in the early chapters of Genesis. Well, I'll grant you, it supports the idea of a flood. It's not necessarily a global flood. Why does it have to be a global flood that preserves 492 feet? All right. So why does it have to be a global flood to preserve 492 feet? There's plenty of local floods that could preserve 492 feet. And by the way, that it is a rational explanation for the preservation of these footprints. Right? There's a mud flat, and it has to be somewhat dewatered. It can't just be mucky mud. It's got to be like mud that's firm enough that a big, heavy dinosaur could stand on it, not just sink down to its kneecaps. Which also speaks to the fact that some time has passed in order for the sediment to settle to the point, all right, to dewater to the point to be able to uphold a dinosaur. So that also is a problem for young Earth creationists, and it's a flood geology failure. But you've got a dinosaur that walks across this mud flat. And then maybe it dries, right? The whole area dries up, right? You've probably all seen, you step in mud, dries up later, and there's your footprint. There's your boot print. And yes, most likely it's going to erode. Yeah. But you could also have, if it's in a lake bed, and then, a storm comes in, raises the lake levels, and then the storm has, it's muddy water, and then the mud the sediment falls out of that water and forms a new layer of mud on top. You've got preservation of those footprints. Right? As long as new layers keep getting piled on top, you're eventually going to have those footprints preserved in that layer. And eventually when those layers get eroded down to that particular point, then we see them. Right? Which is why we're only seeing a tiny fraction of the footprints in the fossil record. Right? If we know of millions of footprints that we've actually seen and documented, the fact that most of the rock has been eroded off, and that there's lots of rock left, lots of layers of rock that haven't eroded, means that if we've seen millions of footprints, that means there's billions of footprints still in the rocks left today, much less all the ones that have eroded. So hundreds and hundreds of billions of footprints have been preserved in the geological column, which requires there to be millions and billions of organisms that were somehow alive during a global flood and and walked around on surfaces and many, many, many different levels, somehow during a chaotic, completely global flood event. The prints are so beautifully preserved that the team had to work out which animals passed through first. They believe it was a sauropod because the front end of its large round footprint is slightly squashed down by the three-toed megalosaurus that walked on top of it. So this area has a set of footprints going one direction, another footprint coming a different direction. One is stepping on top of the footprint of the other. So the footprint had to be made, right, at a different time than the passerby. And so we have other footprints in the geological column where we have like, many series of mini animals. Actually, there's a great set of elephant footprints in Saudi Arabia where there's a whole herd of elephants, right, walking through. Then it appears that those footprints dried and eroded just a little bit. And then there was another time where another elephant walked across, perpendicularly across all those footprints, stepping on them. And they're a little fresher. They were all covered over, right? And at the point they were covered over, one set of footprints was newer than the others. And we can see that today, even though it's millions of years later. Right? All of that actually suggests that time has passed, right? And how did that time pass? Like during a flood, which is depositing hundreds of feet of sediments above those footprints, right? They have to be exposed long enough for that mud to form and for the footprints to then dry. The mud has to dry somewhat in order to not simply be washed away. Footprints are so pristine that even after supposed 166 million years, scientists were able to identify which dinosaurs the prints belonged to. Emma Nicholas, a vertebrate paleontologist from the Oxford, said, their three toes are very, very clear, right, in the print. Perhaps because that was only made 4,500 years ago. Frank Sherman seems to be under the impression that if something was 100 million years ago and preserved, that it should have eroded to the point where it'd be really hard to recognize them. But the whole point is they've been underneath rocks. I mean, they've been preserved in the rock, right? And the rock is preserving them. Many, many layers of rock above it. That rock has been eroding, yes. But the rock that's in the middle of that sediment column has not been eroding, right? It's just been sitting there, right, for 100 million years. Once it gets exposed, it will begin to erode. And yes, those footprints will experience erosion and become less clear. But the moment they're exposed, in this case, they have a new exposure. Oh, they had an exposure that had already, somebody ran across. And then they peeled back more rock, right? Exposing for the first time this layer of preserved footprints. And they're very fresh, right? They're just as they looked when the footprints had been made and covered with those sediments. The creature making these fascinating tracks were 100% dinosaurs created on day 6. The tracks are well preserved like one would expect from catastrophic flood deposits. No, that's not what I expect from catastrophic flood deposits. I expect them to be all like lots and lots and lots and lots of layers of sediment being put down. Those sediments are going to be extremely soft, muddy. They're not going to they're not dewatered. They're not able to hold the shape of that footprint. And also, if you have rushing water coming across, they're going to immediately wipe out those footprints. Right? You have to have time for the footprint to dry somewhat, to harden, right? So that they don't get destroyed by the next layer of sediments coming by. That's not what I would expect from a catastrophic flood deposit. Finally, their amazing preservation, rather than being totally destroyed, isn't what one would expect after supposedly 166 million years of nonstop erosive forces. There are no erosive forces going on, right? Until the rock reaches the surface and then begins and gets exposed, right? It's not undergoing 166 million years of erosion at that particular location. Yes, the entire rock column, portions of it are being exposed and eroded. A mountain is being eroded, but the inside of the mountain is not being eroded, right? It's being exposed at some point, at which point it's been preserved for 166 million years. And at the point it's exposed, that's when it begins to be eroded. And it may get eroded within a few hundred years. It might get eroded within 10 years of being exposed very, very quickly. But it was preserved for 100 million years in essentially the same condition over that entire time. All right, Frank Sherman doesn't realize that to preserve footprints requires a variety of different special conditions, of which a global flood doesn't provide many of those conditions at all. And this article is just kind of really silly. Does that trackway lead straight to a young Earth? No, it leads straight to the fact that it doesn't lead to a young Earth at all, right? He thinks it's shocking that, like only a flood, a giant flood that covers the whole Earth for some reason. I still don't understand, like, why can't it be a local flood? And there's been hundreds of thousands of local floods in history. Hundreds of thousands of local floods. And yes, even in a local flood, the chances of preserving tracks is probably fairly limited. But if you have hundreds of thousands of dinosaurs living over millions of years, hundreds of thousands of dinosaurs alive at one point, and they're all living over, at any point in time, over 100 million years, there's 100,000 dinosaurs alive on Earth. And each one over the period of a year is making several million tracks, right? They're stepping millions of times. And half the time they're making some kind of impression of where they're walking, right? You're making trillions and trillions of tracks every year for millions of years, right? Even if only 0.0000001% of all those tracks somehow manage to get preserved just in the right spot, you're still going to end up with billions of footprints preserved for you in the fossil record, in the geological column. On the flip side, for young Earth creationists, they can only have the number of animals that were alive when the flood began, right? So here's the moment the flood began. That's a day in time, right? On the Earth. And let's say there's 100,000 dinosaurs alive at that moment. That 100,000 dinosaurs, they're going to be like, I guess, running around, like they're going to be swimming most of the time, but maybe there's going to be like some land exposed here and there as the water's sloshing across the Earth. And then they got to like quickly run out there and, well, they got to lay eggs and nest and do a bunch of other things too that we find in the fossil record. But they're running around on mud flats somehow, and they're leaving tracks. Essentially, they all have to get preserved, right? Don't all the tracks have to get preserved? Because you only start with 100,000 dinosaurs, and, in the space of a couple weeks, maybe they make a couple 100 million footprints. But we have hundreds of millions of footprints preserved for us. There's hundreds of billions of footprints, right, in the fossil record, I'm sure. Right. But let's say there's just like 100 million footprints. That means they all got preserved. Why would they all get preserved? It should, even in a global flood scenario, it should be even harder to preserve footprints. Right? The water's sloshing all over it. The sediment is just really fine. It's just like immediately going to get washed away. There's no opportunity really to preserve footprints during a global flood. And so even if you could draw up a scenario where like a few of them could get preserved under really specific conditions, like this, there was a mud flat and it had this particular consistency, and the water didn't rise and slosh too fast over it and wipe it away, but it kind of rose up softly and laid down some stuff. There was a quiet period during the middle of the flood. You'd have to draw out a whole very difficult scenario in order to show that like a whole trackway of footprints could be preserved during a global flood. And we have millions of them. So that means the percentage of tracks they laid down that get preserved is super high during a flood, despite the chances of them being preserved as being, objectively much, much lower. So as I said before, in an old Earth scenario, you only need to have 0.0000001% of the footprints that actually made be preserved. In other words, it can be an extraordinarily rare event. And yet there can be billions of footprints preserved for us as a result of the fact that they're happening over long periods of time, and just a few get preserved each year, right? Dino trackways do not lead straight to a young Earth. They lead straight away from a young Earth. It's a flood geology failure. All right, I'll stop there. As I said before, done multiple videos on this showing other specific tracks, and we've looked more specifically at the calculations of those numbers and things in other posts. And so I'll try to link one or two of those to this video. All right, that's it. Thanks for hanging out. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.